following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zig Zag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, at the 420 Studios down by the lagoon, as they say. In Alameda, everything is down by the lagoon. And I'm flying solo today, but I've got a terrific guest on the phone. He's a returner to the airwaves. I think you've done about 3 or 4 shows. You did one with Claire. I think you might have done one with Ian way back in the day. But I'd like to welcome back Noel Hynd. How are you, sir?
Good morning. I'm fine. How are you doing, Ralph?
Oh, great. Last time you were here, we talked our mutual love, the Cathedral of Cathedrals, the Polo Grounds in New York City, where I spent a lot of my misspent youth was in the right field grandstands with my grandfather watching Don Mueller and Willie Mays and Monty Irvin in that outfield. Tremendous days, and our talk really brought back some great memories, and couldn't wait to get you back. But I want to talk about your project today. It has nothing to do with baseball, and if you would, introduce the topic.
Well, I'm going to talk a little about my father, and who was a true crime writer, and a couple of the cases, and specifically one that he worked on in his career. To backtrack for a second, my father's name was Alan Hynd, first name A-L-A-N, last name H-Y-N-D, and some of his stuff is still on Kindle and on Amazon. And my father was kind of nudged out of high school by his parents, who didn't believe in education. They were Scottish immigrants, and they felt that you go to work in the fields as soon as you possibly could. He resisted that, eventually left. He was born in Trenton, New Jersey, somehow found his way to Boston around 1920, and got a job as a reporter on the Boston Post. He went in looking for a job, encountered a couple of really gruff old news people just by wandering in the door, and they said, "What the hell are you doing here, kid? What do you want?" He says, I want a job with the paper. What do you want to do? I want to report." So they give him a pencil and a pad. It's a Monday. You give him a pencil and a pad and say, "Go find some stories." And that was it. On Friday,
that was his training. That was his training.
Get out there. And he started working. Somehow, it wasn't hard to find crime in Boston in the 1920s, as you might imagine, or any American city in that era. So he just kind of followed his nose. But within a few weeks, so he managed to survive the first week on the newspaper and said, okay, you win coming back the second and you get $10 a week. So he's in there for a few weeks, and suddenly there's chaos in the newsroom, and the editors are trying to throw every possible reporter at a big case that is breaking. And it's the original Charlie Ponzi case, the Schindler. It wasn't a matter of being a Ponzi. It was Ponzi himself, who was an Italian immigrant, endlessly charming, a complete con man, sort of almost a prototype of the con man. You're a great con man when they name a swindle after you, for heaven's sakes. So
the original swindle, too.
Absolutely, yeah. Although I don't want to get going too much on the Ponzi case, because that's a story for another day. But Ponzi had done something similar a few years earlier in Italy, which is why he had come to the United States. and then recreated his own game. And it was a refinement of a scam that someone had pulled in Italy in the 1880s. Anyway, this began, to flash forward a bit, this began my father's career in writing about crime, which continued well into the 1960s. He must have covered maybe 1,500 cases in his career, and most of them were fascinating cases. Many of them were cases that stood by themselves, but he also, in other words, things that it happened and it really didn't have any legs in terms of other generations knowing about it. But he also covered people like John Dillinger. He covered Ma Barker. He covered Bonnie and Clyde. He had an incredible contempt for J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. I thought they were a bunch of phonies, something which I feel also, again, that's for another day. But however, there were three cases in his career. He also covered, by the way, the Mad Bomber in New York in the 1950s, George Metesky. Anyway, there were three cases that stood out that he always talked about. One was Ponzi, the other was the Lindbergh kidnapping, and the other was the murder of a very wealthy Canadian man who was also a British subject by the name of Kerry Oates in the Bahamas in 1943. And I am in the process of writing a trilogy of books following my father's career, focusing on those three main cases, which are Ponzi when he was a young guy, 20 years old, 17 years old when he was covering that case, because he was born in 1903. Ponzi, and then the Lindbergh kidnapping and the execution of Bruno Hauptmann, whom my father felt was innocent as charged in the 1930s, and then the Oates case, which broke in 1943, but which had final ramifications for my father in the early 1950s.
Now, I'm familiar with the first two cases. Would you fill me in on the third?
On the Oates case?
Yes.
Yes. To put it in 100 words or less, I can't do 25 words or less. I can only do 100 words or less, which I guess is good for a podcast. Kerry Oates was one of the wealthiest men in the world, socially prominent, self-made multimillionaire through mining claims in Canada. Fascinating guy in his own right. He moved from Canada to the Bahamas, I believe in the late 1930s, to essentially avoid British taxes. However, he surfaced as a socially prominent man, even though he was, even after he was made a baronet by the king as a reward for money that he was contributing to the tax base in England and the war effort. On the early morning of 1943, Oates was murdered in his home in the Bahamas, and it was an absolutely grisly crime. He was either clubbed to death or stabbed with some sort of sharp instrument in the back of the neck while he slept in his home, and then his body was crudely set on fire by somebody using canned insecticides to get the flames going, and then they sprinkled feathers on the body. They ignited it. The intention must have been to make it look like a ritual murder, and then to burn the body and the house down so that any kind of evidence would be, incinerated. The body didn't burn properly. I'm sorry, and Oates was discovered about 7 a.m. by a friend. The book that I wrote based on that case is called Ashes from a Burning Corpse, and that's kind of the starting point of that particular episode. Go ahead, you had a question.
Wow, that sounds exciting. Who was diabolical enough to kill him in that manner?
Well, that's sort of on one hand, that's sort of tipping the hand of the whole story, but no one was ever convicted of it. The governor of the Bahamas at the time was the Duke of Windsor, the former king who had abdicated. And the Duke called in a couple of thoroughly incompetent Miami cops to come down. He went past his own Bahamian police force to investigate the crime, and he told them who to focus on, which was a local suspect and someone the Duke didn't like. They put the man on trial. They were so sure that they were going to convict him that they ordered the rope to hang the guy ahead of time before the trial even started. And the investigation started there. It was, needless to say, heavily tainted, heavily biased.
Right. Now, the fact that they were that convinced that they were going to get a conviction, that they ordered the rope, really tells you something about the jurisprudence of the time and maybe our time.
Well, yes. Basically, the Duke got what they want. It was the Bahamas at the time was colonialism on steroids. It was a black, heavily black population descended from slaves and people, men and women who had escaped slavery. A complete plantation mentality. The local population was of black people, people of African descent, was essentially exploited by the white people who owned stores and owned property. If you were black in the Bahamas at the time, you couldn't own a business. You could do sort of service jobs. You could be a waiter, you could be a cab driver, you could be a garbage collector or something, but you couldn't own something and you couldn't sell something. So essentially, the white people who were camped out in the Bahamas at the time set up stores with fixed prices to exploit the local population. And then, of course, there were wealthy people there who were laundering money and just sort of parking money offshore from the United States or from the United Kingdom to avoid taxes.
Now, was it a colony of the British back then, or?
Yes.
Okay. How did we acquire the Bahamas? From what I understand, they're now our colony.
Well, I believe there were some American Bahamas, and then there were things like Grand Bahamas, which remained under British control. And I believe that remains. They're independent today, breathtakingly corrupt, but basically most of those islands were under UK control. But of course, it got a little confusing in 1943 during the war, because the United States basically was running the war effort in that area. So American planes were landing there, whether they had permission to or not. You had German U-boats circling the places. It was quite common for Bahamian fishermen to go out and they'd be looking around and they'd see a U-boat periscope, 100 meters, 100 yards away.
How did your dad find this story?
The story found him. He was living in New York City at the time, doing quite well, actually, because he had a bestseller earlier in 1943 called Passport to Treason. It was about U.S. involvement in, Nazi spies in the United States. And that became a bestseller because Walter Winchell, the great news radio voice of the day, led off his Sunday evening news show on the radio by saying, this is an alert, every American should read this book. So this book went from obscurity to the bestseller list literally as fast as the publisher, McBride, could print copies. So my father was kind of a headliner writer of the day, and one of his editors in New York called him and said, "Are you interested in covering a murder case that just broke?" And he said, "Not the one in the Bahamas." And the editor said, "Yeah, do you want to go down there?" So apparently he went down and covered the case in person, and along with, by the way, Ellery Queen, who was the, I forget the man's real name, the fellow who wrote under the name of Ellery Queen. So they were filing dispatches, and as soon as my father got there, he thought, this is the most fixed investigation I've seen since the Lindbergh investigation. I mean, they order a rope for the guy before they even indict him. I mean, what's going on here? He also, in the first week he was down there, he ran into an old friend of his by the name of Raymond Schindler, who was one of the great private detectives of the era. And
the name is obviously familiar from the Schindler list. Was there any connection there?
No, none that I know of. This was an American Schindler who was also a self-made man who set off as a private detective in San Francisco in like 1908 or something like that. Made a name for himself by solving crimes that the police had either bungled or failed to investigate properly. Schindler, interestingly, worked across racial lines, which was somewhat uncommon for the day. Schindler would look at a case where they had strung up a black defendant and basically called out the injustice that was going on. There was a famous case in New Jersey, almost a quintessential fixed case of a white woman who claimed a black man had assaulted her. And they had a guy on death row, and Schindler went down and said, "No, this guy didn't do anything." And eventually he found a guy, white guy living in a rooming house, who confessed to the crime. The only reason I bring the racial thing into it is usually in those days, if an innocent black person was convicted of something, he did not have very many white friends who would come in, or white supporters who would come in and get involved in the case.
Okay. How did he know? What gave him the idea that the man was innocent, and that what led him to the rooming house of the white person?
We're talking not about the Oates case now, but the case in New Jersey, Schindler?
Yes.
Good question. I'm working from deep memory on that one. The crime just didn't make sense. I believe the man had an alibi, and the police had not suppressed the alibi and not even brought it into court. And my father, Schindler basically knew how cops operated back then, and they would just want to clear a case, and often they would pin it on somebody who they didn't particularly like. So it was, the case just didn't add up, as many of them don't. If you look at them in, if you look at them in a way where you're not trying to fit the evidence to the result that you want, a lot of cases didn't make sense in that era.
Okay. Does working with your father's books and experiences bring you closer to your dad?
You know, that's a very interesting question. Yes, in strange ways. He wrote, in 1957, there was a big compendium of true crime stories that he had written called Murder, Mayhem, and Mystery by Noel Hynd. You can still find it in used bookstores. And it was an accumulation of about maybe 50 to 80 classic true crime cases that he had written about over the years. The Oates case was in there. The Ponzi case was in there. and the Lindbergh case led off the book. The title in the Lindbergh case was Why the Lindbergh Kidnapping Case Will Never Be Solved. And he was absolutely right. He was writing about 20 years after the commission of the crime and the execution of Hauptmann. But reading the text that he left, he died in 1974, by the way. Reading that text, I can hear his voice, and as I read, I can see where he left off with what he could print at the time, and then what kicks into my memory is the stuff that he used to tell me privately. When he died, I was only 27, and unfortunately, I never had that many years as an adult to really probe deeply into a lot of those cases with him, because there were a lot of cases that you couldn't really print the whole story at the time. Anything that touched upon homosexuality, you had to stay away from. Most American magazines at the time didn't want to print a case involving African Americans. They figured white people weren't interested. So it brings me closer because in many ways, including the fact that I can kind of see the compromises that he had to make in terms of libel and invasion of privacy to write the cases. Also, back in those days, you had to be extremely careful of writing about somebody in a crime case who was not actually involved in it. In other words, the brother of a victim even, or the sister of a perpetrator. So once those people died off over the years, when my father stopped writing maybe in the late 1960s, early 70s, a lot of people were still alive who figured into these cases. Now they're gone, and as I go back and revisit some of those cases, I can tell pretty much the true story of what was going on. I actually discovered something when I was doing some research on my father. The New York Times in 1951 identified him as the highest paid true crime writer in the United States. I never knew that. Now, granted, there weren't that many of them, because this is, years before these guys who get the big bucks these days are writing true crime. It was sort of a subgenre, but it had a steady audience, mostly of people who bought magazines and prowled around the paperback racks. We're talking about.
Did your dad ever write for the radio? Any of these shows, Racket Squad or any of them?
I don't even know the answer to that. He went out to, basically after becoming a successful writer-editor in the 1930s, he moved permanently to New York City and lived there first with his first wife in the early 30s, then married my mother in 1938, and they got a apartment, hold on to your hats now, 530 Park Avenue, 8-room corner apartment overlooking Park Avenue. He once in the 1960s laughed and said it was $250 a month when we moved in. That's like a $25 million apartment right now.
It was rent controlled, no doubt.
Yes, it was. Of course, they left in the 1950s, and other people obviously moved in. I'm sure it's all privately held right now, probably not even by an American citizen. So he was living in New York. I've gotten away from your initial question about whatever.
About the radio. I'm just a radio nut, and as a matter of fact, I have
I'm sorry.
First cousin of my mother wrote. I mentioned Racket Squad. That's the first show that came in. Wrote for Racket Squad. His name was Stanley Niss, and he later became a producer in Hollywood and produced Pendulum and a few other things. But
my father went out to Hollywood in 1939 and 1940 because I know it was before my sister was born in 1941, and he did some radio he wrote some radio stuff that was all true crime at the time, and then later had was some involvement with a show in the 1950s, also on radio in New York.
Okay. Noel, how does your style, your writing style, differ from your dad's?
Well, similar but different, to use a Yogi Berra-ism. When I write about the stuff, the book that we're sort of talking about today, Ashes from a Burning Corpse, I wrote with his voice. So it's a first-person book. So we get to hear we get to understand how he came into the case, what the ramifications of the case were for him, and how he and Raymond Schindler were investigating the case in the Bahamas. I tried, nobody can recreate his voice the way I can because it's very similar to mine, but when I start dealing with his material, it's almost something that surfaces in me. So I can recreate his voice very, very well. I have my own voice for my own books, and my nonfiction voice, which I use, for example, in The Giants of the Polo Grounds, is different than the one I've used for espionage novels. But the similarity is that my father could look at a really sordid case and laugh about it. And so there was always sort of a wink and an ironic tone to his work, and even a sense of humor in sort of the darkest areas, almost a little like Stephen King does. And so that when I write the true crime stuff like Ashes, that voice surfaces and it's different. It's a little more of a hard-bitten reporter type of voice than my normal voice would be in writing about espionage or supernatural stories or baseball. I should footnote
Noel,
that.
did he tell you that you could be a writer?
Oh, yeah. He
recognized your talent?
Yes. In fact, he almost handed off the career to me because the way I got into writing true crime on my own in the late 1960s is I was home from the University of Pennsylvania for the summer, and I was looking around New York City for a part-time job or a full-time job to make some money for college. And he gets a letter from Oslo, Norway, from a Norwegian and Scandinavian wire service that had always printed his true crime stories in Europe in translation. And they asked him if he had any more stories because I hadn't seen anything from him recently. And if he hadn't been that busy, would he consider writing directly for them? The pay was like $75 for an article, which was chicken feed at the time. And we were both in the living room of our home, and he was just about to throw this away, and he looks across the room and said, "Did you find any work for the summer yet?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Here, take a look at this." And so I said, "Well, yeah, but they want it from you." And he said, "Oh, it doesn't matter. You write it. We'll sign my name to it." So that's how I got started. I thought that would be a great summer job. And listen to this. I kept that as a part-time reporting job from 1968 until 1986.
Whoa.
Yeah, I had sold movies deals on the side in the 70s, and I still kept that thing, and I'd be making maybe, the pay rate went up, I'd make maybe $1,000 a month, and just stash it into a funny money account and use it for travel money and going to Europe and things. I was heartbroken when that came to an end.
Okay, your dad told you that you could be a writer that day, if at no other time before. Who told your dad that he could be a writer, and what gave him the moxie to walk into a newsroom and say, "Ich bin da, here I am"?
I wish I'd asked him that question. I think it was one of those jobs that kind of found him. When he got to Boston, he worked, I remember him telling me one time he worked in a shoe store. He just hated the day-to-day drudgery work. And my conjecture is he wandered into the Boston Post really just looking to see if he could be a newsboy or whether there was something better than, giving people Florsheim shoes to try on. And he just had a knack with it. He caught on very, very quickly. I'm sure it was rough and tumble in ways that he never described to me, because basically Boston working class, he was Scottish by origin. So Boston working class stuff, of course, was heavily Irish and significantly Italian at the time. So he was kind of the odd guy out. But he also knew how to straight shoot with people as well as sniff out the BS that was being put forth. And it's funny. In later years, I got to know a wonderful lady who lives in the East Coast, whose father was, I believe his name was John Toland, who wrote about World War II. And he was kind of a self-made writer also. And when I was talking to Tammy, Toland's daughter, a couple of years ago, she said that one of her father's starting points for any story was never accept the official version of events. And that is exactly what my father never wanted to do. He learned very quickly that somewhere, usually, somebody was lying, someone was protecting somebody didn't want you to know about something. And I think he sort of almost felt it was a moral challenge to be a pain in the ass and sort of dig around and embarrass the people who were covering up something or who had something to hide and who were taking advantage of other people.
Okay. No, you're a second-generation journalist, the way I look at it. Were you as offended as I was, not even being a journalist myself, are you as offended as I am about the events of the day and Trump trying to basically throw journalism under the road, under the truck?
Along with jurisprudence and civility to go with it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, talking about the free press and fake news and all that, does it just send a coldness through your system like it does me? Because you mentioned Europe, pre-Nazi Europe and what have you. This seems a lot like it, what's going on today. And I wonder if you think of it in those terms.
I do, actually. It kind of jumps out at me because I've done so much history. Again, one of the books of mine that has sold best is called Flowers from Berlin, and it's about the era in 1939 and 1940, pre-war, about Nazi spies in the United States. And in doing my background research for a book like that, it is inevitable that you get into what was going on, not just in Nazi Germany, but also in the Soviet Union at the time, with suppression of the free flow of ideas and the free flow of the truth. And it is almost like a cookie cutter. You attack the press. You attack the minorities. It just seems like in all of these countries, including ours, unfortunately, there's 38% of the people who want a totalitarian who will go along with this stuff. And it is the responsibility of the rest of us to get good and angry about it and vote the bastards out of office and get rid of them in a lawful manner.
What comes to mind is we've always been taught you have to go back to history so it won't repeat itself. You have to learn what happened. But we seem to be repeating history that didn't work. There was nothing that worked about fascism and Nazism and all that. It was totally wrong for the planet. Yet we regress. This is, 80 years later. It's crazy.
Absolutely, and it's not just from the right. It's also from the left. I've got nothing but contempt for the extremes on both sides. I'm a little more sympathetic to the left than the right, but certainly not totally. When you're in the middle, everybody's mad at you. It was totalitarianism from both sides, and a good part of the number of people who are living today don't seem to recognize it and don't seem to care much about it.
Okay, in today's day and age, being in the middle has changed drastically. Like Nixon would have been in the middle were he alive today. So, what is it that about the polarization on the left side that really irks you? It's easy to say on the right side, this and that, craziness over there. But what on the left side? How could you be too liberal, I ask?
Interesting question. I don't know whether it's too liberal. I think it's a matter of when certain people on either extreme get to the point where they cannot recognize a reasonable argument coming from the other direction. I'll give you an example. I went to a prep school in Connecticut, which was mostly conservative at the time. I was one of the pinkos that was there. But the thing is, I would have some fierce discussions, I don't want to say arguments, politically, with some of my best friends who were very, very conservative. The issues of the day were the war in Vietnam, civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we could usually find an area of agreement, of something that really, should go forward in American public life. And right now, it just seems that we're into character assassination, not listening to anyone reasonable on the other side. And I don't mean listening to these goddamn white nationalists and bigots and anti-Semites who, have been parading around. But there are reasonable arguments about almost everything, and somehow we've got to get back, if we care about our country, we've got to get back to an area where everybody can be listened to who has a reasonable point of view. And I think the left can be, I think in the 1960s, the left was far more unreasonable and far more out there than elements of the right were. And now it's gone in the other direction. It seems to me that the crazy right-wing people today are sort of where the crazy left-wing people were in the 1960s in terms of street violence and stuff that was going on like that. I will footnote that, however, by saying take a look at who was murdered in that era. It was almost always people who were, shall we say, left or center. President Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. So you still had a heavy undercurrent in the United States of right-wing violence into the political system. Certainly, the left was planting bombs, in front of banks and things, but the right was actually going out and shooting at people.
Right. Makes a big difference. What would you have done if journalism didn't come into your life?
I have thought about that for many years, and I don't really know. I guess playing center field in the National League or the American League was ruled out by lack of skill. So,
left field wouldn't be out of consideration. A little less range, maybe. Your arm not that great. You can still play a little left.
Yeah, I suppose. I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe editing of some sort. I really couldn't tell you. I was fortunate because when I was 20, this true crime gig came along, and then when I was able to couple that with, I gradually started to write for True Detective magazine, an official detective magazine in New York. So the little sort of summer gig turned into a larger gig, and then I sold my first novel in 1975, which is called Revenge, and then I got a movie deal out of that. So I was pretty much set up to write.
Yeah, you no turning back on that.
No.
I mean, you sell a novel and you get a movie deal, you're not going to sell insurance after that.
No.
Okay.
So I'm not saying it's been easy the whole time, but it's I dug my own ditch. Let's put it that way.
Okay, and you didn't just luck into it, because very few people do that. It takes a work ethic to succeed in whatever you're trying to succeed in. So what is your work ethic? How do you write? Do you make an appointment with yourself? Do you set time? Do you write when things hit your head to write about? What's the process like with you?
Chaotic. I try to get time every day, and somehow I do, but every day is almost every day is different. Here's how it would work ideally. Ideally, I would sit down at maybe 10 in the morning and write for hours, and maybe read a short period in the afternoon, and then do the same day.
Now, you obviously have no boss to do this. What compels you to be that consistent?
A sense of obligation, a sense of wanting to tell the stories, and to be honest with you, nobody's getting any younger. My 60th birthday is deep in the past. So,
right.
There's just
you're talking to a 72-year-old man, but that's all right.
Well, I know that, and you're not that much older than I am. So you get to a point where there's a lot of books I want to write while I still am fortunate enough to be, dare I say, young enough or able enough to get those things done.
Was there any book that went unwritten that you're sorry you didn't write back then? Maybe you lost the opportunity. Anything you would have enjoyed writing?
Well, the one that I've sort of got two on my in the queue right now, which have always been in my mind, and one is getting back to my father's writing again. One is his take on the Lindbergh kidnapping, because he was called into that case. I believe the original kidnapping was around 1934, so he would have been about 31 years old. And his parents, again, immigrants from Scotland, were still alive. I believe he was living with them or near them in New Jersey at the time. And his parents, being immigrants and being not well-educated people, just thought that whatever the FBI was doing, whatever the police were doing, it must be right. And so he would be going off and seeing what was going on in this sham of a case where evidence was being trampled, and the state police were just making a mockery of the investigation. And then he'd come home, and his parents were saying that they, believed everything that they heard on the radio, so sorry to, that this nice Mr. Lindbergh, who, of course, privately was sort of a fascist.
Right. The hero, Lucky Lindy.
Yeah, exactly. you the disparity between the reality of American life and what was really going on. Anyway, so that is one book I have been talking to people about for years and years, and I hope in 2019 I get that one done. I need to write the Ponzi book first and then the Lindbergh book. So that's one of them, and also a sequel to Flowers from Berlin, which I wrote in the 1980s, which was a story about Nazi saboteurs. I have another story involving the main character where I would send him back into Germany in 1943 on a special assignment. So fortunately, I'm getting close to getting to those projects.
Beautiful. Hey, Noel, as usual, you're a terrific interviewee. I hope you get into interviewing on this network, as a matter of fact. We've talked off the air a little bit. You're always welcome if podcasting comes into your head in a serious way. You'd always be welcome on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Just want to tell you.
Thank you. I will. I will keep thinking about that, and every time I talk to you, you nudge me a little closer to making a positive decision and doing that. So maybe toward the beginning of next year, we can get something going. It'd be very interesting to do. So
that'd be terrific. You. And by the way, that's my job. I'm a nudge. You say nudge. My friends say nudge. So usually used in the context of don't be a nudge like that, right? All right. Well, I'll try not to be. Thank you, Noel. This is terrific. Please keep coming back one way or the other, and have a terrific Thanksgiving. The whole week, the whole holiday season, whatever you worship, whatever you believe in, not just you, everybody out there, make it a healthy one. This has been a rough year for a lot of folks. Living out in California, we're devastated by fires. I'm devastated by mortality. The older I get, the losing people around you, not just sports heroes, not just family, but extended family, close friends, and that's part of getting old. So what I'm saying is that our conversations are a respite from that for me, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ralph. Always a pleasure, and look forward to chatting with you again soon. Thank you.
That'll be great. Let's keep it going consistently. And for those of you who are listening out there, it is Thanksgiving weekend. I want you to do me a real solid. If you enjoy our offerings, would you be kind enough to box up some new or lightly used children's books and take them to the Head Start program in whatever community you live? Kids that are involved in that, who need Head Start, need a bunch of stuff, but they need to read, develop a respect for reading, get their noses out of the computers and the devices, develop an imagination, and become school ready, ready to succeed, ready to compete. You have to have communication. You have to be able to write and read. So get them some books. Get a neighborhood drive together. Those kids will love you for it. And I think that would be a nice way to commemorate the holiday season. And thank you for listening, everybody. We'll be back when we do. Adios. The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.